Inaugurals can be a very nerve-wracking occasion for the person who is professing. Indeed, professors have been known to try and avoid an inaugural and to view their impending inaugural lectures with more than a little dread. Not so Ailsa. I asked her, was she looking forward to the evening? Was she dreading the evening? She said, no, she said, I'm looking forward to it. You bet, she said. I'll have a captive audience and I get the chance to speak about political culture, work that I'm passionate about. So, without any further ado, I present Professor Ailsa Henderson and her lecture, The Imagined Electorate, Values, Perceived Boundaries, and the Regional Rehabilitation of Political Culture. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought the anecdote was going to be about people who avoid their inaugural lectures and still have not given them Professor Tierney. So, it has been more than 20 years since I started my undergraduate education in political science at the Université d'Ottawa, and from then till now, I've been helped along the way by a series of excellent teachers, supervisors, mentors, colleagues, and students, and I wanted to single out 4. The course that convinced me that I wanted to pursue a career in political science rather than just use it as a degree to get into law school was not the sort of course that you would expect to change your career. It was La vie politique en Ontario, political life in Ontario. The one in Quebec was the one that everyone wanted to take. It was the way the course was taught, both as an exploration of politics in Ontario and as a masterclass in how to gather and use empirical evidence to take part in a wider debate occurring in political science articles and books about the way things work that had such influence on me. And this wasn't just reading what other people had to say about politics in Ontario. For the first time, someone suggested to us that we could and should consider ourselves participants in that debate. And if you wanted to prove that people in Northern Ontario voted more or less than other people, if you wanted to prove that constituencies with higher proportions of Aboriginal people tended to vote Liberal, if you wanted to prove that the theories about the way people vote or the way government operates were right or were wrong, you were provided with the tools to ask and answer those questions. There was little statistical analysis involved, tables and averages were more the norm, but it was completely transformative for me in my developing political science mind, and I have never forgotten it. When my colleagues hear me talking about the benefits of inserting methods or empirical exercises in courses, it is precisely because this is the moment that for me opened up a world of truly never-ending research questions and the pursuit of answers. And so my first thank you is to Professor François-Pierre Gingras at the University of Ottawa. I am indebted to the University of Edinburgh Centre of Canadian Studies, which has provided me with an attic room in 21 George Square while I taught for them and completed my PhD, as well as various scholarships along the way. I am grateful to its last 3 directors, Jed Martin, who was one of my PhD supervisors, Colin Coates, who hired me for my first temporary lectureship, and Annis May Timpson, who was not only a valuable source of advice for research, but also offered me a visiting fellowship to Edinburgh while I was working in Canada that allowed me to complete my second book. She also introduced me to the person who would become my husband at a Canadian Studies conference, so I can safely say that the Centre of Canadian Studies is partly responsible for 1 book, 1 degree, and a happy family with 3 noisy but lovable children, which is impact of a different kind, I suppose. This is the 3rd university at which I've been honoured to work, and I'm grateful to my colleagues, both past and present. The process of peer review is perhaps never far from our minds, and so we might be tempted to think that it is in the evaluation of our written work that the influence of peers begins and ends, but it is also something that happens on a daily basis. My colleagues have taught me lessons in the practical elements of academic work, in curriculum design, in best practice for data management, in how to write grant applications that will actually get you funding, as well as lessons less subject to obvious metrics and perhaps best summarized as a generosity of spirit, of which one sterling example is Richard Simeon, who passed away recently and is very sorely missed. Last, I'd like to thank my family, my parents for providing financial assistance and support, my sister and brother-in-law, not least for providing me with a place to live while I worked at universities in 2 different cities, and of course, Stephen. It can be something of a mixed blessing and a curse being married to a fellow academic, especially one working in a similar area. And not everyone is lucky enough to have a spouse who insists that you quote Scotland Act section numbers when you're talking casually about Scottish politics. But he has been unfailingly supportive, and he is the very reason I applied for a job to return to Edinburgh. So I can truly say that I would not be standing here today were it not for Stephen. So those are the thank yous to those who have helped me to carve out a career in political science. But what I want to talk to you about today is political culture. So what is political culture, and why would someone want to spend 20 years studying it? So I'll talk a little bit about political culture. I'll identify it, and I'll say, what is it and why would you even care? A little bit about national identity and political culture, and some of my work on institutional or constitutional change and political culture. I've got a section on regional political cultures and why I believe that looking at regional political cultures help us to rehabilitate the very notion of political culture. And last, the imagined electorate. So what is political culture? Researchers use and define political culture in different ways, and since part of the criticism of political culture is that it is subject to woolly definitions, it does make sense to be quite clear. And a general quick definition would include subjective orientations to politics, but we can desegregate subjective and we can disaggregate politics. The subjective element distinguishes between cognitive, affective, and evaluative elements, what people know, feel, and think about politics. And Gabriel Almond, one of the seminal authors of political culture, says we should also disaggregate politics so that we look at the system, process, and policy parts. So putting all of those together, the subjective definition of political culture includes what citizens know, feel, and think about the political system as a whole, the methods by which it operates, and the policy it generates. And critics argue that such a definition encourages researchers to treat political culture as little more than public opinion. Palmett and Whittington, however, remind us that political culture is in fact more than just subjective elements. It's a concept that deals with the political system as a whole, as a property of the aggregate, and therefore it must include objective elements as well. They invoke Easton's identification of political community, regime, and authority, and argue that the political culture of a state will involve not just subjective orientations, but these more objective components of political culture as well. They argue, furthermore, that there are structural, symbolic, and conceptual elements of each, and the relationship between these is set out in Table 1 below. So political institutions are relevant in terms of the meaning they provide and the norms they engender. So it is this concept that I've been studying for the past 20 years, and you might well ask, why? Largely because it provided me with the tools to explain the world around me, and two things are central here, and both surface, I think, in different aspects of political culture. So the first biographical note has to do with my parents, who, as you might have guessed by my name, are from Scotland. My mother is from Fraserburgh, my father from Aberdeen, of a Gaelic-speaking Gress-born mother and an Aberdeenshire farming family father. Both teachers, they emigrated to Canada in 1969 to Windsor, Ontario, thanks to a recruitment drive by the Ontario Board of Education within the Commonwealth. They were but one of a long line of Scottish immigrants to Canada commemorated on this helpful stamp here. While I was growing up, it was clear that my parents were not Canadian. My mother's Fraserburgh accent, then unsoftened by time, served as a daily reminder to others that she certainly wasn't from Windsor. On the other hand, neither were most other people's parents. A randomly selected school photo shows 25 children, me in a kilt, 15 of whom had at least one parent not born in Canada, but instead in Jordan, Lebanon, the Philippines, Japan, Vietnam, Hong Kong, India, Hungary, various parts of the former Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy, Scotland, England, Ireland, and so on. Being the child of immigrant parents was a pretty normal thing in Windsor in the 1970s and 80s, and we managed, as every immigrant family did, by taking home from school each day little lessons in what we were supposed to be doing as Canadians. We need pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving. It has to be a turkey, it can't be a chicken. You pronounce it Burger King, not Burger King. Replicating conversations in immigrant households throughout the country. My parents stuck out less in how they adopted a sense of Canadianness, although admittedly they had a pretty easy ride. Will Kimlicka's comment on immigration in Canada, that we are so supportive of it, largely because the early waves were predominantly English-speaking, were predominantly white, were predominantly Christian, comes to mind. By the time large numbers of non-white, non-Christian, non-English speakers arrived, he says, we'd already convinced ourselves of the myth of our own tolerance. In a Christian, predominantly English-speaking country, my parents adjusted pretty easily. What struck me at the time was more what living in Canada did to their sense of Scottishness and the expressions it would find, the way distance from the source of your national identity dilutes and alters it. And I remember, too, a period of time before they had acquired Canadian citizenship, but after they'd been gone from Scotland for about 20 years, when their national identity seemed to hang, suspended, as likely to be both Scottish and Canadian, as Linz Moreno would say, as neither Scottish nor Canadian. And it's maybe no surprise that I pursued a PhD at Edinburgh and that my dissertation was on national identity and political culture in Scotland and Quebec. Throughout, I received excellent supervision from then head of department, Alice Brown, Lindsay Patterson, who's here tonight, and Jed Martin, and once finished, I set about converting the dissertation into a book. Scotland and Quebec are, of course, two of the usual suspects of comparative territorial or sub-state politics, and they've been used to good effect by others. My external examiner, Michael Keating, compared them before I did. I am not the only person in the school to write a book on Scotland and Quebec. Jimmy's here tonight. Nor am I indeed the only person in politics and international relations to write a book on Scotland and Quebec. Nor am I the only person in my house to write a book on Scotland and Quebec. The resulting book, Hierarchies of Belonging, was the result of a mixed methods approach using interviews, content analysis of documents, including party manifestos in the post-war period, election results, as well as attitude surveys like the Scottish Social Attitude Survey and the British Election Study. The book argues that we establish markers of belonging, that some markers are inevitably more inclusive than others, and that in both Scotland and Quebec, there is a tension between the resolutely civic markers of official sources, like the ones espoused by nationalist political parties, and the ethnic markers that are sometimes employed by the electorate or by individuals. It argues, too, that claims to belonging are not made in a vacuum, that they are made in the face of messages about who can and should belong, and we have expectations about how claims to belonging will be received. So one possible example of this is a table up at the top here from the book using what is now very old polling data by Crop in Canada. And we can read them as, so the 72% you see here, that's the percentage of all of the people spoken to who believe that the Anglophone minority are part of the people of Quebec. And if you look at it, you can see that Francophones, 69% of them believe that the Anglophones are part of the nation of Quebec, whereas Anglophones are more convinced. 77% of them say, no, absolutely, Anglophones are part of the people of Quebec, they're part of the Quebec nation. That's if you ask them about the aggregate. If you ask people about themselves, well, do you believe that you're part of the Quebec nation? Quebecers are more convinced, 77%, but the Anglophones, who believe that as a group they belong, don't necessarily themselves believe that they belong. So in the aggregate, in the general sense, yes, absolutely, Anglophones can be part of the Quebecois nation. Well, how about you? Do you belong? Oh, no, not necessarily me. So the book looks at what the consequences of this might be for political culture. In terms of a career-long view, I think one of the key contributions of the book is the definition that I used and continue to use as a short form for political culture. So political culture can be seen in the relationship both perceived and actual between citizens and the state, and the relationship both perceived and actual among citizens. By including the relationships among citizens, I'm saying that the way we draw boundaries around who we include in the citizenry, in the demos, matters as much as what we think about the state. So political culture is more than just our subjective orientations to the system. You know, this is how we do things here. This is how our government should act, or this is how our government should treat us. But it's also our definition of our fellow citizens, who the we is and who the our is in the first part of that sentence that matters. By including perception, I'm saying that we must focus not just on reality, not just on the way the institutions actually operate, but perceived reality as well. The frames of reference and meaning that govern these relationships, including political symbolism, rhetoric, and competing conceptions of the polity. Why does this matter? I would say that it matters partly because it speaks to the capacity for multiple political cultures to exist within a single state, and the extent to which political cultures tolerate or adapt to diversity. But I'll return to that in a minute. The second biographical story that relates to political culture has to do with where I was brought up. Anthony Cohen's work on personal nationalism suggests that our sense of national identity is informed by our locality, So our understanding of Britishness is informed by the fact that we were maybe brought up in or currently live in Scotland. Our understanding of Scottishness is informed by the fact that you were brought up in East Kilbride. My Canadian national identity has always been influenced by the fact that I was born and raised in Windsor, Ontario, down at the bottom of Ontario, in what is sometimes referred to by its detractors as the armpit of Ontario. I am not one of those detractors. Windsor is a car town, subject to the unkind boom and bust features of the economy, and in the 1980s, when I was growing up, it was grim. Boarded up storefronts on the main street, an auto industry limping along, or limping along by the standards then, certainly worse now. For much of my childhood, as now, it had amongst the highest unemployment in Canada. But perhaps none of that is as important as the fact that Windsor is in the shadow of Detroit. So much in the shadow, in fact, that when you drive down the main street, the skyscrapers in the center of your vision are in fact Detroit across the water. So the bottom picture there, those are the skyscrapers of Detroit. As you drive down Olette Avenue, you can see the handy Canadian flag there. The cities are similar in many respects in their reliance on the auto industry, in their related unemployment rates. But if Windsor was grim in the 1980s, it was safe. Detroit was both grim and, for much of the 1980s, the most violent city in the US. Over the past month, I've been deliberating about which graphics to show you to catalog just how grim it is in Detroit. Do I show you murder rates since 1980? Do I show you murder and violent crime rates? Do I show you total crime? As I've picked two, but as a good methodologist, I've got extra tables of slides at the end if you want to compare data. So, the number of murders throughout the 1980s were more than 600 per year. That's the size of the incoming cohort for all single and joint honors students in the School of Social and Political Science. It stands out among large American cities to the extent that it has become the benchmark for American violence. If you want to know whether you live in a violent city, you have to compare yourself to Detroit. If you're doing better than Detroit, you're still probably okay. If you're worse than Detroit, you really, really need to worry. The figures in some year were comparable to the number of homicides in Canada as a whole. So a city with 1 million inhabitants had as many murders as a country 30 times that size. And throughout this period, the number of murders in Windsor was typically in the single digits, often zero. So what's the relevance to political culture here? Well, when you're taught political culture in Canada, two themes are inevitable. Theme one, why is Canadian liberalism so different from American liberalism, the Hortz-Horowitz research? Or put another way, why are Canadian values different from American values? Theme two is offered as a partial answer and looks at fragment cultures, breakaway elements of political culture that set up shop elsewhere. The typical Canadian example of a fragment culture is the United Empire Loyalists moving en masse into Eastern Canada and what would 20 years later become Upper and Lower Canada during and after the American Revolution in the late 1700s. This is an important part of the myths of Canadian political development, commemorated in stamps again, and in statues, that's in Hamilton, Ontario, plaques in Ontario and Quebec, and taught to school children, like this one here, as a key moment in Canadian history. From a political culture perspective, their influence was crucial. Arriving at a time of institutional flux in Canada, they had a disproportionate weight, instilling their sense of anti-revolutionary conservatism on emerging political institutions. Crucially, their influence was largely unchecked by their natural political opponents, so that the entire polity came to exist within this particular frame of reference. I'm oversimplifying the argument a little bit. For Lipset, their influence stems from the fact that they arrived before the point of congealment, before the political institutions in Canada had become rigid and set. My parents, I suppose, were operating their own version of a fragment culture writ small, instilling Scottish values in us outside Scotland. Their values not necessarily the dominant values of the country then or now, but refracted through their understanding of them from Fraserburgh and Aberdeen, and then distorted by both distance and time. The Loyalists are offered up as a partial explanation for why Canadian political culture differs from American political culture, and it was of obvious interest to someone who was raised in a border town. Detroit always also served as a negative example to Windsor. You can explain Windsor's voting habits by pointing to the car industry or the strength of the unions or high unemployment, but the slightly Hobbesian city over the water offered obvious lessons about the benefits of social democracy. So we can see that Windsor and Detroit have different patterns of crime. They also were of disproportionate size. Windsor's population 200,000, Detroit's over 1 million, although that figure has been slowly declining since 1950. They were also of disproportionate cultural influence. Windsor in the 1980s had one newspaper, one CBC radio station, one CBC television that for most of my childhood was closed, but later reinstated when money became available. Detroit, by contrast, had 2 daily newspapers, around 5 TV stations, and countless radio stations. And in the days before satellite television, this mattered a great deal. So from a political culture perspective, the agents of socialization were completely tangled. By day, in school classrooms, we were taught the importance of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, of multiculturalism that operated as a mosaic, not a melting point, of the importance of our United Empire loyalists, of burning the White House in the War of 1812. By night and at weekends, we were watching American television, traveling over to support American sports teams, reading American papers, buying things in American stores, although not in our households. And layered on top of that, in our homes, often a third culture instilling its own values. If we think of Breton's notion of institutional completeness, the more that a nation controls its agents of socialization, the more institutionally complete it is. It's hard to imagine a city in Canada less in control of its agents of socialization affecting its population. And it wasn't until years later that I'd realized that I'd been raised in perhaps the most American of Canadian cities. I assumed everyone lived in Canada in the shadow of a large, dysfunctional American city. And when I moved to Ottawa, it was like moving to a different country. And that country was Canada. When I returned to Canada after my PhD, I had intended to pursue a postdoc on the impact of institutional change on political culture in Westminster democracies. So the new electoral system in New Zealand, the defeated Republic referendum in Australia, devolution in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Nunavut. But in the end, after fieldwork in Nunavut, I realized I had more than enough for a monograph on that alone, and so that's what I did. Nunavut is the newest territory in Canada, created in 1999. It houses 30,000 people spread across a score of communities, no 2 of them joined by roads. It was the result of a land claim for Inuit, who are 85% of the population, as well as a political accord to create a new territory. The starting point for the book was that a new legislature and any new polity does not face a tabula rasa for political culture, or indeed for the working culture of its legislature. It argues that political culture in Nunavut is a tangled mix of 3 legacies of political culture, each transmitted through separate agents of socialization. Traditional pre-contact and early contact Inuit political culture with its lessons on leadership, resource distribution, and power. The political culture instilled by the federal government and the way it sought to create Canadian citizens out of Inuit in the 1960s and 1970s through a fascinating set of pamphlets on federalism with drawings and references to the big government and little government, and pre-division territorial political culture. And it is with these 3 legacies that contemporary political culture in Nunavut is emerging. Along the way, the book seeks to debunk a few myths about political developments in Nunavut, arguing in particular that the reason for the absence of political parties in Nunavut has absolutely nothing to do with a desire to replicate Inuit approaches to decision-making, but in fact stems more from the rate and form of institutional change when it moved from being a predominantly appointed council to a predominantly elected one. The book relied on a wide range of resources, transcripts of translated interviews with Inuit elders held in the archive in Igloolik. That archive in Igloolik is the top picture there. It's sometimes called the doorknob to the center of the earth. Archival records from the federal government, data from the Nunavut Household Survey, as well as surveys conducted with candidates for the Nunavut legislature. It is actually this work that is often more cited than anything else I write. You can buy it in large airports and northern stores and various Arctic communities. But the process of conducting research in the Eastern Canadian Arctic is expensive and time-consuming, and with a job in Edinburgh and a young family, this particular case study is in abeyance. But the lessons about the value of disentangling political cultures have continued to influence my work. So in 2007, I returned to Edinburgh and I gave up my tenure-track job in Toronto for a 2-year limited-term appointment in territorial politics. The chief reason for the move was a personal one, but I would have been hard-pressed to pick a department anywhere in the world better suited to my research interests. The territorial and EPOP research groups, with their largely overlapping membership, house an unparalleled concentration of scholars working in various subjects throughout the school on sub-state comparative policy, parties, and political behaviour. And in an effort to make my job a permanent one, I was encouraged to apply for funding, and the result was a 2-year Marie Curie International Incoming Fellowship to study political culture in Europe, extended to a 4-year Marie Curie International Incoming Fellowship by the arrival of 2 children. The central research question for this project was whether a nation-state can house more than one political culture, and if so, why, and to what effect. Answering this question requires an analysis of the way political culture treats diversity within states. Political culture is fundamentally a state-centered concept. The defining work, Hominid Verbis, 1963, The Civic Culture, was employed in a normative pursuit. Some states are more likely to achieve positive outcomes, whether democratization or economic development, and the key, they argued, was an ideal political culture, specifically an ideal mix of trust and efficacy. Too much trust, and you let your politicians get away with anything. Too much efficacy, and you'll never give them room to govern. Because scholars were trying to compare the democratic success of states, they went looking for political culture at the level of states. And the spatial scale was not incidental, but was woven into the heart of political culture research and stems not from the ability of the concept to explain state-level phenomena, such as democratic stability. In other words, it doesn't stem from how well it explains stability or predicts stability, but from the nation-state's establishment of borders within which the political is defined. And yet, there are references to diversity within political culture throughout the literature, comparing subcultures of masses and elites, for example, and there's a fair bit too, particularly in the American literature on regional political cultures, the bulk of which explores the impact of migration on political culture of different regions. So just as there were researchers tracking the impact of the United Empire Loyalists in Canada, so was their work exploring the impact of Scottish migration to the American South and the generation of what they call a macho culture of honour. Predominantly herders from Scotland as well as Ireland and the borders, they protected their flocks from threat with violent retribution, hence, they argue, the fondness for firearms and the Second Amendment in the American South. This theory is not without its critics. The most popular example, of course, of regional political cultures is Daniel Elazar's 3 political subcultures, moralist, individualistic, and traditionalistic, and that map on the left shows where they can be found in the United States. And the location of them depend on the particular migrants who arrived, but there are other approaches to regional political culture in North America. On the right is Joel Garreau's 9 Nations of North America, and for any Canadian, it's always fun to see what is described as the empty quarter, where no one lives. We can see work on regional political culture in Germany, exploring enduring divisions between East and West, and in other federations like Canada and Switzerland, as well as non-federal states like the UK and Spain. I'm thinking of one Linz's 8 Spains here, where there is a history of cultural pluralism. And the different literatures are talking, however, about slightly different things. My contribution to this literature is to argue that there are 2 main types of regional political culture based in 3 separate root causes. Regional political institutions, by which I mean sub-state political institutions, the territorial clustering of demographic or socioeconomic traits, and center-regional or center-periphery relations within a polity. And I would argue that these don't operate in isolation, but rather they interact to produce 2 main types of what I call regional political cultures. The first, sub-state political cultures, and the second, regional subcultures, or what might be called the hard and soft versions of regional political cultures. I'll distinguish them briefly, and then I'll move on to the imagined electorate. So in federations, each sub-state unit has its own borders, its own boundaries, and it provides a space within which the regional values can be reflected in public life and in public policy. So devolution was so important for Scotland, so argued various parties at the time, because Scots had different policy preferences, and only with its own legislature could it create policy that suited those preferences. The sub-state units of any federation, or even any decentralized state for that matter, provide space for a distinctly regional political culture to operate. And if we think of the definition of political culture, such polities can easily have a process, system, and policy so that we can see what people know, feel, and think about how the regional political system operates, the methods it uses, and the policy it generates. These are like states writ small, and these are what we can call hard regional political cultures, or what Simeon and Elkins referred to as small worlds. The other type of regional political culture can be generated by either the territorial clustering of particular demographic or socioeconomic traits, or the relationship between the state and the various regions within it. Here, religion or ethnicity or language might determine cultural outlooks, or the private cultures of groups might influence their approaches to politics. So these United Empire loyalists again. Or it might be that the central government treats different regions in a particular way, so setting high taxes for resource extraction that are perceived to take riches away from one region and distribute them for the benefit of all. We should distinguish between policy that targets particular regions and general policies that just affect particular regions more than others. An obvious example of the latter is the perception in Scotland that the fiscal policies of the UK Conservative government throughout the 1980s were an attack on a national political culture because of the disproportionately high levels of public spending in Scotland. These are soft political cultures. They are regional variations in the state political culture, so they're regional pockets of high trust or low efficacy, for example. And if we return to that definition, that relationship between citizens and the state, the difference between the two is largely the state that people have in mind. So in a hard regional political culture, people have the sub-state political system in their minds. In a soft regional political culture, they have the state as a whole in mind. I mean, these are ideal types, and they might overlap. So you might have a hard Nova Scotia sub-state political culture within a soft Atlantic Canadian regional culture. Now, I've used Scotland as an example, both for hard and soft. And which is it? Does Scotland have a distinct political culture? I'll get to that in a minute. By looking for political culture below the level of the state, I would argue that we're forced to ask and answer some of the unanswered questions about political culture, about the role of the state, boundaries, and socialization. If we define a state as an authoritative set of political institutions, we can distinguish between regional political cultures that have a state of their own, the hard ones, and those that are regional variations of statewide political culture. The two offer different forms that invoke different agents of socialization. This depends in part on institutional completeness, or what Ruskin refers to as devices of control. So how regionalized are the agents of socialization? To what extent is a region capable of instilling regional values, either real or imagined, through primary, secondary, or tertiary education, through its media outlets? Is it insulated by language? And so on. And part of the Marie Curie project that I was involved in required me to map the extent to which key agents of socialization are regionalized across Western Europe. The two different forms of regional political culture reinforce different types of boundaries, both objective and subjective, and it is this that I want to address in my final section. Throughout my career, the questions I've been asking have changed over time for three main reasons. As I've read more, and as more has been written about particular subfields, it's possible to ask more specific questions. Second, the methods I have been able to use have changed as I continue my long-running sideline and forcing myself to learn new statistical packages and new statistical techniques. My postdoc advisor, Neil Nevitt, packed me off to Michigan for the summer to take statistics courses, for which I'm grateful, and he's one in a long line of mentors and colleagues for whom I've learned so much about statistical analysis and survey design, including Andy Thompson, Lindsay Patterson, Steve Brown at Laurier, in addition to my current collaborators at Cardiff and Stirling, McGill, Concordia, Essex, Glasgow, and here in Edinburgh. But perhaps the most substantial transformation has been in the data that I've been able to access. When I began conducting research as a PhD student, I was using other people's data sets and then able to insert the odd question into other people's surveys. This is me as a PhD student at a party conference in Aberdeen with my box, which says surveys on the front, photocopied on the department photocopier. And Lindsay reminded me the other day that the very first time he saw me was on the train on the way to one of these party conferences, stapling madly surveys that I would then pounce on people and give to them and then follow them around with a box, making sure that I got my copies back again. So I'm using other people's data than through a slightly laborious process collecting my own. It's been a long transition, beginning with the Nunavut Social Attitudes Survey, or North Pole, then working with larger teams to create bespoke one-off survey data sets like the Citizenship After the Nation State data set or the Provincial Diversity Project, to the current situation today, securing funding for large multi-wave surveys like the long-running Future of England survey, our 2-wave panel on risk and the referendum, and our 3-wave Scottish referendum study. Being able to draft the questionnaires for such surveys and ensuring that regional samples are sufficiently large mean that I'm now in the fortunate position of being able to provide data to answer research questions that I started asking 20 years ago. And the best example of this is in how I've been able to finally answer long-standing questions about the importance of perception, or specifically perceptions about perception in political culture. So one of the criticisms of political culture is that it is vaguely defined, that it's just public opinion, that it's not possible to determine how it operates. And because the original unit of analysis was always the state, the borders of the state were the boundaries of political culture. And if you conceive of political cultures as operating below the level of the state, you need to identify how you will determine when and where a political culture exists. So existing empirical approaches to identifying regional political cultures within or across states tend to pursue one of two strategies. They search for distinct attitudes, behaviours, rhetorical or policy outputs across existing regions of a state. So you look at Scottish attitudes, you look at English attitudes, and you see if there are any differences across them. Or you identify criteria that would suggest the presence of a distinct political culture, and you cluster them to see if there's any spatial logic there. And this is Ron Inglehart's value map, where he's looking at what he considers to be the building blocks of political culture, putting them on in a scatter plot, and then seeing if they cluster together geographically, or if there's some other underlying logic to where the states find themselves. And this is work that I've done as well on regional political cultures in Canada. A third method looks at the differences in attitudes between places and tries to account for it by demographics, and then whatever is left over is political culture. But I will go on record as saying I think that's just rewarding people for misspecifying their model. I have my own approach, but first I want to talk about Scottish values. A summary of this is in Sex, Lies and the Ballot Box, which contains chapters by 50 members of the Elections, Public Opinion and Parties Specialist Group of the PSA, and makes an excellent holiday present for your favourite elections anorak. 50% of the proceeds go to EPOP. My chapter in there is on the myth of meritocratic Scotland. So as I stated earlier, a key part of the argument for devolution was the existence of distinctly Scottish values, and this is important. It had an impact on the type of politics that people wanted. In other words, it wasn't that Scots had a different sense or different values about personal space. It was that values that were related to politics. Different values about resource distribution, different values about the role of the state. Specifically, the argument goes, Scottish values were diametrically opposed to the values of conservative governments that have had a very different vision for resource distribution and the role of the state. And with devolution, and critically with jurisdiction over health and education, Scots could ensure that their values were reflected in policy. This is not, I want to stress, the preserve of nationalist parties or pro-change parties. All parties in Scotland argue this. More meritocratic, more communitarian, more supportive of state intervention in the economy and EU membership, Scots are typically portrayed as the left-leaning social democratic foil to the essentially conservative, Eurosceptic, class-bound England. But even the Conservative Party emphasises its own preferred Scottish values of thrift or entrepreneurialism and industriousness. The arguments, made so often against Thatcher in the 1980s, are made again against a Cameron coalition. Independence, as we heard recently, would allow Scots to govern themselves with policies that reflect their own values. Much of the rhetoric about distinct political cultures concerns fundamental economic and social values, whether a state should be interventionist or not, whether women with young children should work outside the home, whether the state should support censorship in certain circumstances, or ensure resources are distributed from rich to poor. On these sorts of issues, and on the fundamental evaluations of the state, our sense of trust, our sense of efficacy, the claims of distinctiveness typically outstrip results. Scots are not more meritocratic or communitarian than English or Welsh residents. This is as true for the Scottish values often cited, support for the welfare state, support for a more interventionist state. Now, this is not a new argument. Miller, Timpson and Lesnoff, in their book on UK political culture, argue that there are not statistically significant variations in attitudes. This is something that John Curtis has been pointing out long before me. As a PhD student, I read his work suggesting that if we're looking at value differences in the UK, we should speak of North Britain and South Britain rather than Scotland and England. and his recent Acumen lecture tracked attitudes from 1999 to 2013, showing that there are not, typically, statistically significant differences between Scottish and English attitudes. To provide you with a sense of this, we can look at 3 typical measures asked in the 2013 British Social Attitudes Survey. The first is a welfarism scale, with higher scores implying support for a more interventionist state, a left-right scale, with higher scores implying that the respondents are more right-wing, and a libertarian authoritarian scale with higher scores implying greater support for censorship. In no case are there significant differences between Scotland, Wales, and England. Now, does this mean that Scotland doesn't have a distinct political culture? No, it's not that simple. First of all, we see meaningful differences in some items. Scots back different parties in elections, they hold different national identities, they vary in how well they perceive the current political system to be working. In other words, does Scotland get its fair share? Does England get its fair share? And they also vary in the constitutional solutions that they propose. There are other little quirks. You tend to find smaller differences when you're asking social attitude surveys outside of elections and larger differences when you're looking at election surveys. And the thinking is that the election itself primes people's national identity and primes a sense of regional difference. Attitudes to Europe are slightly different. On some measures, at least, Scottish voters are more supportive of the European Union. But even with Europe, the differences depend on the survey and the particular question asked. The 2014 British Social Attitudes Survey shows few significant differences across Scotland, England, and Wales on whether to stay in the EU. The 2014 Future of England survey shows Scots are significantly more likely to believe that membership in the EU is a good thing. Scots feel differently about the UK. They feel differently about how well it runs and how it should organise itself, but they don't necessarily feel differently about how a state in general should operate and what it should do for people. Second, you could argue that the items where we do see differences are the system and process parts of political culture, just maybe not the policy parts. And if we're thinking of the objective components of political culture, there is enough there to suggest that devolution and administrative devolution before it provided boundaries for a distinct political culture. Third, I want to make the case for how we could identify where we might find political cultures. Put simply, differences in values is not enough. In his critique of Wildavsky, Leighton chides, by focusing only on shared values, Wildavsky misses the point that people with strongly opposed views can share a culture, and people with similar views can come from different cultures. If our definition of political culture includes objective, system-wide, as well as subjective elements, then this certainly will help, as we'll be looking beyond subjective public opinion. But within the subjective side, I would argue that we need to look for 3 things. The first, evidence of difference. The second, evidence of the perception of difference. And third, systematic variation in the relationship of components. Evidence of difference is fairly self-explanatory. The third one, systematic variation in the relationship of components, is maybe less so. If, as Jaworski and Tunney claim, systems differ when the patterns of relationships among variables differ, this suggests that if gender or language is able to predict a sense of trust or efficacy in Wales, but not in Scotland or not in England, then this too could be proof of a distinct regional political culture. The key one, I would argue, is evidence of difference. If citizens perceive a political culture to exist, believe it to be different from that of their neighbouring region, believe that one's fellow regional citizens hold particular and unique values, then this is evidence of a distinct political culture, even if regular public opinion polls are never able to prove that such values hold much sway in people's minds. Here, it is self-perception that matters, that the members of the possible political culture believe it to exist, much like Renan's daily plebiscite. Perception is important because it helps to identify when we have a distinct political culture and when we just have normal variation in attitudes within an electorate. In other words, it helps to determine a tipping point between a political culture with normal noise variation and one housing multiple distinct regional political cultures. This is more than just a different sense of national identity or a distinction between us and them, but a sense of difference, real or imagined, in some element of the cognitive, evaluative, or affective, symbolic or conceptual construction of the polity. This also sets a lower limit for disaggregation. If we can identify multiple regional political cultures within a state, one might rightly ask whether we can have distinct political cultures at the level of municipalities or even neighbourhoods. And while those living within a particular area might share a sense of partisan politics or public policy, there is not necessarily an articulated view that residents share a common political culture. Now, we have evidence that politicians believe Scots to have distinct values. They are referenced in party manifestos across polities. They've been discussed in the Scottish Parliament. The graph here shows references to Scottish values in every parliament since 1999, and we can see that references to Scottish values in parliamentary debates is up with SNP governments, but the references are not made exclusively by SNP MSPs. That's the politicians. What does the electorate think of Scottish values? In the recent Scottish referendum study, we said to people, you know, different people voted for different parties, or different people had different preferences. Some people, however, even though they didn't back that option, might have found certain arguments of the other side appealing. What about you? What did you think about the claim that Scottish values are different from those in the rest of the UK? And I think that preamble is important, because this wasn't just a straight up question about political values. It was a question about values, but priming for the other side. You know, so we might have been dampening some of the support from no supporters. A quarter of the no voters are not at all convinced in this statement. They think absolutely not. Scots, I find this deeply unconvincing that Scotland has distinct values. But if we look at the yes voters, the orange bars, they are far more convinced that Scottish values are distinct from UK values. There are significant variations as well if you disaggregate by national identity and also by the party that people vote for. Conservative voters, the blue ones, are significantly less convinced of the existence of Scottish values, less than UKIP, interestingly, while supporters of the SNP are most convinced. Now, for me, the interesting puzzle has been the relationship between perception and reality. And there are not meaningful differences across different types of values, but there is a popular conception that Scottish values exist, at least in some sections of the electorate. Where do people think, what do people think about the Scottish electorate's preferences? The Future of England survey contains samples in Scotland, Wales, and England, and it contains questions asking people to evaluate how their region feels about particular issues: cutting immigration, cutting welfare spending, getting tough on young offenders, or supporting gay marriage. And if you believe the line about Scottish values, Scots should think that their region is more supportive of immigrants, more supportive of gay marriage, less tough on young offenders, and less keen to cut welfare spending. The questionnaire then asks respondents much later, how do you feel about a range of policy issues, including the 4 that we asked about before? And this is what we see. This is support across England, Scotland, and Wales for cutting immigrants. So if you're over the line, you're supportive of cutting immigrants. If you're on the other side of the line, below the line, then you're not supportive of cutting immigration. So you can see some variations in Scotland, England, and Wales. This is the perception of where Scotland and Wales are on cutting welfare spending. There was a glitch in the survey, and we asked about the environment in England, so we can ignore them on that. This is where they are in terms of tougher sentences for young offenders. Scotland very much middle of the road here. And this is where they are in terms of legalizing gay marriage. That's the perception. They perceive they perceive themselves to be slightly over the line in terms of support for gay marriage. The results are very much as you would expect. I mean, they're in line with what the myths would tell us about what Scottish attitudes should be. But it's when we look at perception and reality that interesting differences emerge. So we're back here to cutting immigration. This is where the blue dots are where people think that their region is. The red dots are where they actually are. If we aggregate their preferences and say, well, what do you think, and what do you think, and what do you think? We can aggregate everyone and say, well, you're from Scotland, this is your average. You're from England, this is your average. If we look at welfare spending, this is what we see as well. So Scots are, in fact, more supportive of cutting welfare spending than they think they are. Tougher sentences for young offenders. Scots and the Welsh and the English are more supportive of tough sentences for young offenders than they think they are. And gay marriage, Scots, Welsh, English are more supportive of gay marriage than they think they are. What's interesting here is the general pattern we see across England, Scotland, and Wales. English voters pretty much get it right. They typically have small differences between perception and reality. Scottish voters, and Welsh voters for that matter, often get it wrong. Why might England be getting it right, and why might Scotland be getting it wrong? Well, One hypothesis worth testing is that Scotland and Wales have legislatures in which the existence of Scottish and Welsh values are cited as the reasons for creating legislation that deviates from policy elsewhere, and critically that it is a more interventionist or more left-wing polity, because certainly that's the direction of the perception gap. So as far as the subjective dimensions of political culture are concerned, we have little evidence of a fundamental difference on fundamental values, but evidence on process and clear evidence of the perception of difference. This last has been replicated with data in Canada as part of the Provincial Diversity Project. This distinction between evidence and perception helps to explain the sometimes contradictory results we see in surveys and arguments among politicians about whether Scottish, Welsh, and English, or indeed British values exist. So Scots believe they are distinctly left-wing. Their belief in this distinctiveness is reinforced by the rhetoric from politicians and civic organisations, and then it comes to form part of the mental imagery of the Scottish national identity. The emphasis on values as one of several dominant markers of belonging is clearly civic. Being Scottish is portrayed as less about where you were born and more about the values that you hold. Better that, you might argue, than ethnic markers of membership. And one might rightly ask whether it matters if such distinctive Scottish values are less present than assumed. Where's the harm in all of this? It's entirely possible that there is none. It's neither normatively good nor bad, although empirically, I think it's interesting. Perhaps more interesting is the question about legislating for an imagined electorate. For whom are legislators creating policy? When MSPs seek to create policy that appeals to the electorate, or when they frame arguments about the benefits of particular policies, which electorate do they target? The electors that they have, or the ones that they think they have? Certainly we know that Scottish values are invoked when creating legislation. This is two examples, and were cited in debates about tuition fees. Scottish values may be more imagined than real right now, but several decades of legislation seeking to reflect such values could further delineate the political culture it currently seeks to reflect. So what's the theme then that ties all of this together in the preceding subjects on political culture? Fundamentally, it's an act of disentangling. Disentangling regional political cultures from state political cultures, disentangling different forms of regional political culture from each other, disentangling different and sometimes contradictory lessons from different agents of socialization or cultural inheritance, and distinguishing between markers of difference and the perception of difference, the notion that the perceived boundaries matter as much as formal or objective ones. Studying this would not have been possible without the excellent education and training I have received both in Canada and in Scotland, or without the encouragement and sound advice provided by colleagues in both Canada and Scotland. And I'm very grateful to those here today who have helped me along the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ailsa. I won't take very much more of your time because I know that there are drinks and there are celebrations to be had afterwards. But I just wanted to say what a wonderful lecture this was. And I think for me, it really struck home the way in who we are shapes the questions that we ask and the answers that we seek. And what we saw, I think, was a bravura performance, a brilliant combination, I think, of empirics, of passion, of personal biography, and some very, very systematic, hard-headed, clear-sighted political science. So I think that what we have heard tonight shows how deserved your recognition is as an outstanding empirical researcher, political analyst of political culture. You have spent the last 20 years well, and I think we all look forward to the next 20 years of this sort of really sharp, interesting, rich questioning. So thank you very much indeed, Professor Ailsa Henderson, for this memorable inaugural lecture.